Um, we are in the laws of slaves. The more I learn about it, the more I see, wow, how amazing the laws are and how progressive it is.
Hmm.
How progressive. And yeah,
Very aggressive.
well, I mean, the way the world deals with slavery is a different story.
Hmm.
As we spoke about, um, evidivry is only if someone stole and doesn't have how to pay back, then they're sold into slavery in order that they can recompense the person was stolen from. And as our sages say, that someone who has a slave is like having a master because of the obligations you have to that individual that are great. Um, the other time that the person can be sold into is when the person doesn't even own the shirt on their back. They're so destitute, they're allowed to sell themselves into slavery. So no one is selling anyone as a slave, right? In these instances, I mean, there is such a thing. And well, there is, uh, being sold to a non-Jew, and there it becomes a mitzvah. You have to redeem that person because otherwise they're, going to end up being assimilated. So now we're in chapter 4. A Hebrew maidservant is a girl below the age of majority sold by her father. Why would her father do that? Sounds terrible. Because we're talking about, again, being so destitute that you can't feed your child. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
But doesn't that reflect the society that there's someone in your community who is so destitute that the community cannot rally?
So there is the mitzvah of tzedakah. You're right. There is. But still could be in a position that the father still in a position, maybe he's got a bunch of kids and right. Don't think of it so much in our terms today because, poor people today, you know what they own? They own a smartphone,
They are so
right? They own a smartphone. We're not talking about that kind of, I mean, I don't know. Maybe not the homeless on the streets still, but, you know, so we're talking about really being destitute. So imagine you have 4 kids and you can't. So you're right, the community has a responsibility. But who has the first responsibility? The father does, right? So what's the father going to do? The community isn't able, he lives out in the boondocks. He's not part of a community. Whatever. Whatever the circumstance, the point is there'll be a situation where all he can do is the best thing he can do for his daughter is to sell her right. Remember having such a servant, how if you have one pillow, that servant gets the pillow before you get this pillow, right? You only have one bed, the servant gets it before you do. Imagine you're my slave and I have to sleep on the straw and you get to sleep on the bed. Like a different, Anyways, this is the law. Right. When she manifests signs of a physical maturity after reaching 12 years of age and becomes a naira, right? He does not have the right to sell her. So only until that time he can, even though still has authority over her. He may consecrate her to whomever he desires. He could, but he doesn't have that kind of jurisdiction over her, right? As now she's coming into her own authority, not totally, right? That's a 12-month, that's a 6-month period, by the way, till 12 and a half, right? Well, I think we'll get into it. Okay, we're actually gonna. Okay, even a girl's already manifest physical signs. At 12 and a half, I think he's going to say that he doesn't have any jurisdiction over her at all, not to marry her off, not to sell her into, well, 12 already not, right? It has no jurisdiction at all. At the point she can make up her own mind. That's the point. right? And he can't make it for her. Even a girl's already manifest physical signs that she is an islandess. An islandess is um, a girl that doesn't get to physical maturity, right? She doesn't get to physical maturity. And thus is not fit to manifest physical maturity. Sign of manifest physical signs of maturity. If you can let Michael in, thanks. May be sold by her father as long as she is below majority, only below majority. Neither Timtum androgynous may be sold to a Hebrew servant, nor is a Hebrew maidservant, because Timtum androgynous are questionable. Are they male or female, right? Timtum is someone who it's covered over the reproductive organ in a way that you can't tell, and androgynous has both signs, right? So they can't be sold as Hebrew servant or a Hebrew maidservant because we don't know which one they are. A father may not sell his daughter as a maidservant unless he's become impoverished to the extent that he owns nothing, neither landed property, movable property, not even the clothing that he's wearing, right? So, like, no one's destitute like that today, first of all. And secondly, even back in the day, it was very seldom that this would happen. But it could happen because there wasn't a community to take care of, or there wasn't someone because that person maybe wasn't part of a community. Nevertheless, we compel the father to redeem his daughter after he sold her because this is a blemish to the family. So he has to redeem her, right? As we learned, redeeming meaning she's there for 6 years, right? Maximum would be 6 years that she would be. And she was sold for 60 shekel, so 10 shekel a year. And after 2 years, he made money. He has to pay 40 shekel to get her back, right? We compel him to do that because it's a blemish to the family. In other words, it's not just a blemish. It's not just something he did to his daughter. He did something to his whole family because it is a blemish. If the father fled, died, or did not have the resources to redeem her, she must work until she is released. The Hebrew maidservant is acquired through the payment of money or objects that are worth money or through the transfer of a legal document. Right? A legal document. She may not be acquired for a pruta because it's necessary to acquire her with the sum that will allow her to reduce her price according to the number of years she has worked so that she can redeem herself and depart. A pruta is too little, in other words. How is she acquired? Through the transfer of legal document. Her father should write to her master on a piece of paper, on a shard, my daughter is sold to you. My daughter is acquired by you. And give it to the master. The deed of transfer of the Hebrew maidservant must be written by the father. Right? A Hebrew maidservant must work for 6 years like a servant sold by the court, as reflected by the verse, when your brother or a Jew or Jewess will be sold to you. She receives her freedom at the beginning of the 7th year. If the Jubilee year falls in the middle of the 6 years, she is released, as a male servant is. If her master dies, she is released without payment, even if he leaves a son. As a servant whose ear is pierced, as reflected by the verse, and in your maidservant shall you do this. All right, so she is released. Similarly, she may be redeemed by paying a prorated figures that considers the time that she served, like we mentioned, the 60, right? And she worked for 2 years, so therefore it's 40. If her master writes her a bill of release, that's another way, right? He just wrote her a bill of release and waives her service for the remainder of the time. She is released without charge, like Hebrew servant, right? A Hebrew maidservant has the advantage over Hebrew servant, meaning the female has an advantage over the male, is that she attains freedom when she manifests signs of physical maturity. What is implied? When manifests signs of physical maturity and became a naira, she is released and becomes free without charge. And she will depart without charge, as the verse says. With this verse, the Torah granted her another cause to release beyond those granted to male servants. And according to the oral tradition, it was taught that this refers to manifestation physical signs of maturity. This law applies even if she manifests signs of physical maturity on the day she was purchased, right? Yeah. Unlikely, but if whatever, the point is that a maidservant is released, she returns to her father's domain, because let's say she was sold at the age of, 5. Even though I don't know why someone would purchase a girl at the age of 5. What is she going to do? Like what kind of work is she going to do? Right? But whatever, it doesn't matter. These are the laws. That's what's important, right? This is a parameter of the law. So she returns to her father's domain, right? Because she's only 11 now. Or you know what it could be? She was released. She could have been 9 years old, right? And could have been released because a year later she was 10 years old and she was released because it came to Jubilee year, right? So she was released. And so where did she go? To her father's home. Why? Because she's still under the age of majority. Until she attains Bagrus. Bagrus is 12 and a half. We mentioned Naira is 12. It's called a maiden. Bagrus is half a year later, 12 and a half years old. Then she leaves her father's domain. Now, that doesn't mean she can go home. That's not the point. The point is she's not bound by her father at 12 and a half. Pretty interesting. What 12 and a half year old today is not bound by their parents, and they tell them what to do. But at 12 and a half, no, she's not. Now, it might be a better idea for her to go home, and she has, if her father at this point can take care of her, right? But she does have choice now. If the girl is an islandess, remember, is one who doesn't mature physically, right? Doesn't have signs of maturity, who is not granted a period of Naira, but goes directly to Bakras. When she attains Bakras, she is granted her freedom. Right. So since she doesn't have the law of Naira, which means he can't sell her, right, at 12, but she goes directly from being a child to a 12 and a half year old Bagrus, right? And then she grants her freedom. A Hebrew maidservant, oops, is not released if her prominent limbs are damaged, as implied. She shall not depart as servants depart. Some of the Hebrew servant is not released for such a reason. Instead, if his master knocks out a tooth or blinds him in the eye, he should pay him, and he must pay another colleague whom he injures, as explained in Hilchos Chayvul Masik. A non-Jewish slave, if you hit him and you knock out a tooth, he's freed. He's freed, a non-Jewish slave. But that's not the laws we're learning now. We're learning about a Jewish slave, right? But a Jewish slave, a male and female, does not depart with it. You got to pay for it, though, just like you would be any damage you would do to a regular person. You have to pay for that, whatever, again. Thus, we have learned that the Hebrew maidservant is acquired through two means: payment of money or the transfer of a legal document. And obtains her, obtained by two, and she obtains her freedom through 6 means: the passage of 6 years, the advent of Jubilee, second, third, paying the prorated amount of the purchase price, as we mentioned. For the transfer of a bill of release, right? He says, I'm going to release you for whatever reason. The death of her master, the manifestation of signs of physical maturity. Those are the 6 things that she gets her release. If a master of the Hebrew maidservant designates her as a wife for himself or for his son, she is like any other consecrated woman. Now, ultimately, what is actually hope, and it doesn't have to be that way, right? but the master marries her or to her son. Remember, back then you can have more than one wife, right? Biblically, there's biblical law, so you can have more than one wife, or to his son. That she should be, after all, she's been in the house for, for all these years. It makes sense that she should remain in the house, but she has to get married. And she would be like any other consecrated woman. She's not released because of any of the reasons mentioned above, but only because of the death of the husband or through a bill of divorce. And then she would be like any consecrated woman, right? That you get married. How do you unmarry? Is through divorce or your husband dies. The mitzvah is designating the maidservant as a wife takes precedence over the mitzvah of redeeming the maidservant. Better to marry than she should get redeemed and go out. Because after all, she's going to go out either back to her father's home or on her own. I mean, meaning have that she has the choice that she could be on her own. Like, no, that's not the way it should be. She should get married. How does the mitzvah of designating a maidservant as a wife perform? The master tells his maidservant in presence of two witnesses, behold, you're consecrated to me. You're betrothed to me. Behold, you're my wife. This may be done even at the conclusion of 6 years of her servitude before the setting of the sun, right? Before the day ends. And other than that, you're at the very end, right? He could still marry her. He need not give her anything. Why? For the first monies were given with the intent that they would serve as a purpose of consecration. Remember, he bought her. The whole point was that ultimately he should marry her. Right? Him or his son. Right? From this point onwards, he must treat her as a wife and not as a servant. Amazing. Wow. How progressive this is. Now, by the way, she has to want it, obviously. She can't be forced into it. Right? I mean, it sounds crazy, and it's not going to be instituted today. But think of it. God forbid someone is so destitute they don't own their own shirt, right? They have nothing. Obviously, they got to be wandering. Or maybe they have a home. They have, no, it said it doesn't have any property. No, he said no movable. Maybe you have a home because it said you didn't have land because then you could sell the land and you have money, right? But I guess
what could he have that inside his house?
no, maybe he doesn't. I'm not clear on that. It doesn't mean he's literally wandering with a family. Is that what's happening? What an amazing thing to do, right? That you could sell your daughter, you could get a few dollars and, but that money that you get was ultimately, hopefully, that she will marry into that family and she has a life. That's the idea. Right. Now, if he's doing that when she's 6 years old, she has no choice. She has no choice at 6 to be sold. Right. The father can only do it because of the destitute situation. So the Torah is obligating him. In a sense, it's almost, I don't know, no, actually it's not an obligation. It's giving you have the right. It's not an obligation, you have to do it. But because it would seem like it should be, but it's not. You're 6-year-old, you don't own the shirt on your back. So, well, you don't have much option. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's because you always have options. There's always an option.
Well,
but so therefore, that's why it's not an obligation. You can find work today and take care of your family.
can't.
No. You can't say he can't. He doesn't. You can't say he can't, and therefore it's an obligation. I'm only explaining why it's not an obligation. It's because he could get a job today, and as we said, that the moment He has money. He's obligated. He is obligated to redeem her, right? Because otherwise, it's a blemish on the family. So he is obligated to redeem her, but he's not obligated to sell her. Why? Because there's always God can always give you an opportunity. There's always a possibility that Hashem will give you and provide for you.
But he tried, yeah.
No, you're not listening to my point. Therefore, he's permitted, but he's not obligated. The difference between permitted and obligated.
Accept the nuances.
Well, wait a minute. Permitted means you can sell her. Obligated means you must sell her. He doesn't have to sell her. So I'm saying, why not? It's because God could provide for you today, even though you don't own the shirt on your back. He could provide for you today a means that you would be able to take care of your family. So therefore, you're not obligated, you're just permitted. That's my point. Okay? As opposed to when you do have the means, you become obligated to redeem her.
Right. Yeah.
Ah, she can marry into that family. Yeah, and that's why, wow, I just hopped because why is it not just about her? It's because maybe it's better for her with that family because he might marry the young boy. Maybe it's better for her, but it's a blemish on the family. It's a blemish on the family.
So it may not happen at all, but if it does,
right? So redeemer, so it becomes a right because afterwards, like, oh, Shidduch came up for Yankel. And his sister Sarah, she's a slave. Like, not gonna be so easy to shidduch. Not gonna be easy to find someone who'll be interested, because people do look, and rightfully so. People do look at the family. You're supposed to look at the family, right? Now, in the end, God has someone for that girl, okay, or for that boy, right? But it makes it more difficult. That's all. Okay. Now, he may not designate two maidservants as wives at the same time, because the verse says he will designate her. In other words, in the singular. He does. How does the master designate a maidservant as a wife for his son? If his son is past majority, he gives his father permission to designate the maidservant as his wife. The father tells the maidservant in the presence of the two witnesses, "Behold, you are consecrated to my son." A master may not designate a maidservant. You had a question?
but she has a choice in this.
Well, number 8. Master may not designate a maidservant as his wife or as his son's wife without her knowledge, although the father already received money because of her. The Torah uses the term biyada, which implies that her knowledge, right? Her knowledge meaning her, not just knowledge, but her consent, right? If the master dies, his son cannot designate the maidservant as a wife, for she obtained her freedom at her master's death, right? So it's finished, gone, right? That doesn't mean he can't marry her, by the way, but he can't marry her. He has to now give her. He has to give her something of value. He has to give her a ring. The father didn't have to give the ring, or the son didn't if the father was still alive, right? Didn't have to because he already made the payment when he bought her. But in this instance, she gains freedom immediately upon his death, so he loses the opportunity to marry her this manner. But again, he could do it regular marriage. Designating a maidservant as a wife is equivalent to consecration, but not to marriage. In other words, it's not chuppah. It's nisuyin. It's betrothal. It's betrothal, right? Therefore, the husband may not become impure because of her. He does not inherit her estate, nor does he annul her vows until she enters the chuppah. What does that mean? Can't become impure for her, meaning if he was a kohen and she died, right? They're consecrated, and he's a kohen and she dies. He can't go to the burial because they're not married. They're only betrothed to each other. A kohen can only become impure for his wife after marriage, not by betrothal, right? Secondly, since they're not married, he doesn't inherit her estate, nor does he annul her vows, as the laws are, right? Until chuppah, that they're married. In other words, the vows that she took that would affect her husband. So he can annul those vows, right?
So if a master, spouse, if she makes vows. Ordinary would it be her
Well, the
father?
father or the husband. You know what? Interesting what you're saying. I don't know if the master can annul the vows. But in the Torah, it doesn't say anything about the master. It only says about the father and the husband. It doesn't say about the master. I don't think a master could. No? Like for example, if she says, let's say the husband really likes her when she dresses with a particular dress. Like, I don't know, right? He really likes the way she looks. And she makes an oath. I'm not going to wear that dress. He can annul that vow because that's affecting him, right? Where her rights? Well, there's no such thing as rights, as responsibilities and obligations, right? In Torah. Not rights. Well, freedom of her rights. No. We only have freedom to do what God wants or not to do what he wants. Right. And so he can annul that vow. If she makes a vow that only doesn't affect her husband, then he can't annul that. Right. Only thing is that's why the master, I don't think, can annul. Yeah, not to my knowledge. Okay. Maybe he'll say something and we'll see. All right, the verse says, if he does not do any of these three for her, designate her as a wife for himself or for her son, or enable her to be redeemed by paying a reduced amount, she will be released without charge when she manifests signs of physical maturity, as we explained, right? Or the 60th year comes, or the Jubilee year comes, right? In addition to ways she can obtain her freedom as a Hebrew servant obtains his, right? A master may not sell a Hebrew servant, nor may he give her as a gift to another person, regardless of whether or not he shares a family connection with him. If he sells her or gives her away, his deeds are no consequences. It says he does not have the authority to sell her to a different man when he betrays her. Betrays her, in other words, that he's not going to marry her, I think. That's way, if I recall. Timothy Master, a master may not sell or give away a Hebrew servant to another person. It appears to me that the only reason Torah had to state this explicitly with regard to a maidservant is that the master is able to designate her as a wife for his son. Therefore, it's necessary to say that he does not have the authority to sell her to a different man. Because he could designate her for another man to marry, his son, only his son. So you might think that therefore he could also sell her to a different man. No. Can't do that. And therefore marry that different man, right? Can't do that. Okay, we're going to stop here.
Thank you,
Wow,
Professor.
amazing stuff. Thank you. I'm going to send stuff from our classes you'll get soon.